Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Nettlefield, a faculty member at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. Thank you for joining today's event, Climate Risks and Migration, a reflective conversation on migration at the US southern border. Today's event is sponsored by Climate Refugees and the Institute for the Study of Human Rights. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Amali Tower. Amali Tower is the founder and executive director of Climate Refugees. She has extensive experience promoting the rights of refugees and forcibly displaced persons. Her work is fueled by her personal journey and struggles as an immigrant affected by conflict and instability. For many years, she has interviewed refugees fleeing conflict and persecution. This gave her the chance to hear the stories of those also fleeing climate change. Out of this work, Climate Refugees was born. Amali, thank you so much for moderating today's important discussion, and I will hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you so much to the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. Thank you to all our participants and panelists. I'd like to start things off by introducing Congressman Joaquin Castro, who's with us here today. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute privilege, sir, to see your leadership, to hear your commitment to refugees and migrants, and now that increasingly climate displaced populations. And it's personally been a privilege as well to work with you this week in your leadership, calling on President Biden at the Leaders Summit today, and your commitment here at home, at the detention centers, and also globally. So I'd like to turn it over to Congressman Joaquin Castro. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and good afternoon to everybody. It's great to be with y'all, even if still just virtually. But I want to say thank you to Climate Refugees and the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia for hosting this event, but more importantly, for all of your incredible work over the years on these issues. I also want to thank this great panel of experts who are doing outstanding work on the front lines addressing issues like climate policy and environmental justice. I'm Congressman Joaquin Castro. I'm very proud to represent a part of the great city of San Antonio, Texas, in the United States Congress. And I'm in my 5th term now. And among other things in the Congress, I'm the subcommittee chair on international development, international organizations, and global corporate social impact. And I know we're here to discuss the intersection between the climate crisis and migration, 2 issues which are already shaping US politics and policy at the US-Mexico border, for example. And I come largely for policymakers and others of those of us who think about these issues with a warning that failure to develop better ways of dealing with both migration and the climate crisis will lead to a far more brutal world. But I also present this in an opportunity for renewed American leadership to be a North Star for the world on these issues. Migration is one of the defining issues of the 21st century. Already, the movements of migrants and refugees are reshaping politics and societies around the world, creating both opportunity and backlash. There are more people displaced in the world today than at any point since the end of World War II. Yet Western governments have largely failed to find a way to manage large-scale refugee resettlement in a politically sustainable way. Acts of political courage, like German Chancellor Angela Merkel's decision to allow 1 million Syrian refugees to be welcomed in Germany, or Colombia's recent decision to grant legal status to 1 million Venezuelan refugees, have been few and far between. Far more common have been the reaction of demagogue leaders who have used scapegoating fears about migration as part of their strategy for coming to power. From Poland and Hungary to the United States, democratic backsliding is associated with the rise of anti-immigrant leaders, while even nominally healthy democracies have both adopted frighteningly harsh anti-immigrant policies, as seen in places like Denmark, Chile, Australia, and Japan, just to name a few. Indeed, many argue for a form of appeasement, that we must build walls ourselves or lose elections to the wall-building demagogues. I reject that false choice for us. We cannot defeat xenophobia by becoming more xenophobic. But we see that large-scale refugee resettlement in developed democracies faces significant challenges. Frustratingly, the principal obstacle is not so much one of logistics, but one of political will. We could resettle refugees in the numbers needed to meet the global refugee crisis if only we would be willing to try. This is an untenable situation, as what we are facing now is just the beginning, as you all know, of the climate migration to come. Already we're witnessing climate-induced displacement in Central America, leading to increased migration to the United States. Crop failure in the highlands of Guatemala and 2 hurricanes in the region are principal causes of the increases in family and children who are being apprehended at our border. While media often uses images of these desperate refugees to fuel partisan debate, it almost entirely neglects the devastating reality in Central America, which leads to migration. And that includes a warming planet and the effects of climate change. And simply put, if your home is flooded or your food supply fails, you're going to migrate. And it doesn't matter who the president of the United States is, you're going to try to come anyway. If the past years of US immigration policy have taught us anything, it's that deterrence does not work. This is a lesson we must learn because we know that as the climate crisis worsens, droughts, crop failures, natural disasters, unrest, and armed conflict around the world will all increase. All of this will increase migration to levels that make even today's numbers seem small. To put it in perspective, there are 80 million people displaced in the world today. By 2050, the World Bank estimates there will be at least 143 million climate refugees, largely from Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. I worry a great deal about what will happen when millions of these climate refugees from non-white nations meet the developed world's increasingly xenophobic political consensus. What will be their fate in the years ahead? That's a scenario that leads to a death spiral for our democracies and our planet. It seems we're writing a recipe for inhumanity in the 21st century that will rival the horrors of the 20th century. But it's not too late to flip the script. Western governments can begin laying the groundwork now to build an infrastructure of migration and refugee resettlement that will be prepared to handle the climate migration we know is already beginning. We must begin with granting official climate refugees and recognize
Sorry, Representative Castro, you are muted.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I've already asked the Biden administration to work to set clear international standards defining climate migrants and protecting as a class those climate migrants, granting them clear legal rights, and to make this case at the upcoming 2021 Climate Summit. We must also work unilaterally with the United Nations and other international organizations to set clear international commitments and obligations to address the impacts of climate-induced migration. U.S. foreign aid and development assistance should also be leveraged to increase climate resiliency, address the humanitarian needs exacerbated by climate displacement, and to facilitate internal relocation for people displaced by climate change. Doing this is a natural opportunity for global leadership by our nation of immigrants, and we must also be willing to lead by example. The United States must expand our refugee resettlement capacity, and the current historically low refugee cap set by the Trump administration. That low cap is unacceptable, and it must change. President Biden should raise the cap immediately and also look at how to pressure our allies among other developed democracies to resettle greater numbers of refugees. We must set ambitious targets if we're serious about building a refugee resettlement infrastructure in the 2020s that's equipped to handle climate migration in the 2030s and the years ahead. To do this, we must also change a political culture across the West that is increasingly anti-immigrant. And we can do this by celebrating the contributions of migrants and immigrants and asylees.
I hope to do my part with the Citizenship for Essential Workers Act, which honors the contributions that immigrant essential workers have made to our nation's resilience amid COVID-19, with the promise of a path to American citizenship. Other democratic nations, such as France and Canada, have already taken steps in this direction. Above all, we must take bold action to address and mitigate the climate crisis, reducing emissions and working to create new jobs and new infrastructure along the way. The climate crisis is an existential threat, but like COVID-19, it's also an opportunity to remake our society in a fair and more just way. That's why developing a way to help those already being displaced by climate change is as essential a part of a comprehensive plan to tackle the climate crisis as building wind turbines and solar panels. Ultimately, we cannot simply respond to the climate crisis with walls to keep out both rising seas and desperate people. There's a special onus on nations that are the largest carbon emitters per capita, like the United States, Canada, and Australia, to take in the people, overwhelmingly African, Latin American, Middle Eastern, and South and Southeast Asian, who will be most impacted by this climate crisis. We must avoid the death spiral of climate-induced migration and anti-immigrant backlash that leads to a warming world of walls and authoritarianism. And we must defeat that grim future with a vision of a world which works together to solve the most pressing global problems of our time, to provide a new home to those in need while working together to save our common home. The decisions the governments and peoples of the world's democracies make in the next 5 years will determine the outcome. I hope you'll be moved to act for our planet and for all of the people that we share this planet with. And I want to say again, thank you all very much for convening all of us today, and thank you for your work on these issues.
Wow, thank you so much, Congressman Castro. That was incredible. I was just nodding along with every single word you said.
No, thank you.
Which was absolutely, I think the word that comes to mind is righteous. Thank you incredibly from all of us for, like I said, for your leadership and for being here today with us. So with that said, as Congressman Castro said, I am privileged to be here with this incredible group of panelists, and I'd like to turn now to this to a very enriching conversation that I think we can have here with people who really are working at the front lines of many of the things that Congressman Castro just spoke about. People who are working at the individual level with migrants and asylum seekers, people who are working at the community level, regional level, and then also at the international level with our multilateral partners. So to introduce those wonderful people, let me present our panelists. We have Erica Andiola, who's the Chief Advocacy Officer for Raíces. We have Adrián Martinez Blanco, who is the founder and director of the Costa Rican NGO La Ruta del Clima, who for the past 5 years, I believe, have been observers at the UNFCCC. And I'm sure Adrián will have a lot to say to us about the upcoming negotiations, COP26 in Glasgow. We have also with us Almo Makitiko, who is from the National Network of Immigrant and Refugee Rights, who has been doing over 20 years of work with migrants, asylum seekers, and immigrants at the borderlands here in the United States, in Mexico. And then we also have with us climate scientist Jasmine Sanders from Our Climate, who does incredibly wonderful work with communities in environmental justice and climate education as well, and with BIPOC communities. So with that said, I think we have, as I said, an incredible group of panelists, and I'd like to welcome them. And let's kick things off by asking each of you to maybe tell us to speak about your work. So we know that you each have different areas of expertise in research and as practitioners and as advocates. To help us situate ourselves with a broader understanding of climate migration, can you each comment on how climate change is currently contributing to forced migration in your areas of work and the most pressing challenges you see in your work? Alma, may I start with you, because I know you might do a lot of interesting and challenging work with individuals.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and thank you very much to Representative Castro. His work, his words, and his leadership are just very exciting to know that we have, champions in Congress that understand the root causes and drivers of migration and that are willing to work with communities to try to find some responses, some rights-based responses. So as Congressman Castro mentioned, there's increasing numbers of people that are being displaced from their communities due to climate change. I know he mentioned the World Bank estimating 143 million people that will be displaced by 2050. That's also a conservative estimate. There's some estimates that place 200 million, 250 million of people that will be displaced in the next decades. And this is due in many ways to environmental challenges, but also structural challenges. And I think it's important to delve a little bit more into those. In Central America, for example, we know that communities and countries that are very poor, which some countries reaching up to 70% of poverty levels. But when you look at the numbers, you also, when you look at the numbers more closely, you also know that some of the rural communities are actually most impacted by poverty, with some of the poverty levels reaching up to 80 or more than 80%. So we know that rural communities and rural people are more sensitive to economic, to political, and to climatological crisis. And this vulnerability is owed in many ways to unregulated industries and extractive industries that are going into these communities that are causing extreme deforestation, devastation of local livelihoods, high soil compactation and erosion, and it's leading to disappearing forests and wetlands, which makes rural communities much more prone to fleeing, to being forced to flee their homes and their communities. And they're also making these communities much more vulnerable to hunger and malnutrition, as a result of, these desertification in many ways, these droughts in their communities, and really impacting their ability to produce food for local consumption. So we see that events such as hurricanes, like the recent hurricanes that were experienced in Central America just a few months ago, really makes these communities very vulnerable, not only to migration, but also to hunger and malnutrition, which is the case of many children and indigenous peoples who are much more vulnerable and who are the ones that we started seeing fleeing across, international borders.
No, absolutely, and you're so right. I mean, ECLAC has documented how much rural poverty, how much higher rural poverty is in Central America's dry corridor than even, the national averages in these countries. Erica, if I may turn to you, what do you see? Hi, Erica, by the way. So great to have you and have you here on the panel. What are you seeing over at Raíces? I know you're working with so many individuals, you're, in detention centers. What do you hear from migrants that Raíces is working with?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. And also thank you for having this really, really important conversation. Many times as an immigrant rights organization, speaking out about, the challenges that we have with climate change, sometimes we get asked to just focus on our issue. And the reality is that these issues are absolutely interconnected. And look, we saw that in our own country in the United States when Texas, just not too long ago had such a big challenge with the freeze that happened there. And so many of the people who were actually the worst off were poor people, people of color. And so it's just an example. And I know we're in a different situation in the United States, but just to speak to that I think a lot of people got a sense of why others leave their countries, right, when they have no ability to feed their families, to find better ways of living. So that's just an example. But in terms of what we're seeing at Raíces, and just to give you a little, everybody a little background, we are one of the biggest legal services organizations that provides services to asylum seekers, and we also have a refugee resettlement program. So we get to see both, right? We get to see asylum seekers who come and basically go to Border Patrol, or they come and try to cross the border and turn themselves in, asking for asylum. And then we also receive some of the refugees that are able to come through the refugee resettlement program. And so we have a sense of both. And what we have seen over and over again, and the reason why we're so outspoken about climate change is because even though some of our clients, most of our clients don't necessarily come and say, I left because of climate change. Most of them are not going to tell us that, because many don't understand that that's the reason, right, that they're leaving. But they do come telling us that most, I would say indigenous folks from Guatemala, from Central America, Honduras and El Salvador, many of them are indigenous, and they are leaving their homes in rural areas, as Alma was mentioning. And they tell us their stories that, some of them, like the children right now who are representing in shelters and some of these detention centers for children in the United States, they tell us the stories that, their parents just couldn't survive anymore. They couldn't feed them anymore because, they worked as farmers. They worked, basically they lived out of the land, and they just couldn't sustain themselves, right? So they moved somewhere else within the country, and then they just poverty and violence didn't let them live there anymore. So they had to look for another home and for safety. So they came to the United States. We don't necessarily yet have a number of like how many of the people we serve are climate refugees or are seeking refuge because of climate. Because again, they don't necessarily say that that's the reason why they're leaving, but I can say definitely anecdotally that a lot of the stories really to us point to the fact that it is because of climate change. And so it's important, and I'll end with this, is that we are looking at both issues as interconnected, and that we are, as we continue to reverse, climate change, that we are looking into what are the legal ways in which we can open our arms to people who are fleeing, and that we look at Texas as an example, right, recently, of how people who are poor and people of color will need support and will need a place to live and a place to thrive with their own families. And the United States is a place where people can do that. We are the richest nation in the world, and we should be able to accomplish that.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely true. Adrian, if I can ask you, in Costa Rica, it's not just the United States that obviously is absorbing and having so many Central Americans, leave their countries across and cross borders. Costa Rica has also been receiving, migrants, asylum seekers. Really, that is what we're talking about here. What's the situation there, and And what does, you know, the United States very securitized, very militarized response, you know, look like in the region?
Yeah, well, as you said, many people that are moving across borders end up in Costa Rica, not because probably that wasn't their destiny or like where they wanted to go, but that's sort of like due to the barriers in place for people to not move, they end up stalling in our country. But I think for the Costa Rican and in general the Central American issue on this, it's regarding how it's governed in regards to climate change. We do know that people that are leaving their homes are from the most vulnerable community. We do know that in those vulnerable communities, climate impacts are not only predicted but already monitored to already be to be happening in those communities. And there is a correlation between what is happening on the ground and how is governed the international climate regime. These people are leaving their homes because of loss and damage due to climate risk. It's a risk that is unable to be handled due to adaptation measures. And in the Paris Agreement, that we also know that this is an issue that is badly governed, that is not funded, that is not directly addressed, and that always wants to be sort of packaging within adaptation to climate change in a way to not address it. And then we go back to the issues of why these people are living within our region, within our countries, and they're living because of injustice. We do know that the causes of climate change are based on actions of people, and people have profited on carbon emissions, and countries themselves have developed on those emissions. But the benefits and those who emit it are not equally distributed. That's why within the UNFCCC, within the Paris Agreement, there is a principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Because, for example, countries such as mine has less than 0.1% of the global emissions, or, for example, the same cases for Honduras. So we cannot say that it is not based on injustice. The reasons why people are leaving their countries and leaving their towns and their homes because they have to seek to protect their human dignity is based on injustice, but also the same lack of political action to address loss and damage, to address the causes of why people are leaving, are based on irresponsibility of the international community. So we have this double logic of like punishing people or trying to look at them as if crossing the border to secure your human dignity is something bad. But at the same time, you note that the international community does not address loss and damage, does not address the causes of why people are living and crossing borders. So for us in La Ruta del Clima, the main thing, the starting point of any conversation on these issues, that crossing a border, it's a right. Finding refuge to protect your human dignity, it's a right. And it is an international obligation to secure people to be able to exercise those rights. And we also know that it is an obligation of the international community based on the differentiated responsibilities that countries have to respond and address loss and damage and the climate impacts that the most poor and most vulnerable communities are having, even in the US, even in Central America, all across the globe. And this is an issue of justice, and this is an issue of rights, and anything that stands between the exercise of your human right, it is simply wrong, and it's something that we should constantly address and change.
So well said. Incredible. Absolutely. Which is a perfect point to turn to Jasmine on then, because everything Adrienne just said is so true. And I would amplify, and Jasmine, you're the perfect speaker to tell us about the fact that this is not just an international obligation. This is obviously human rights extend all across the board. How are we seeing this play out in terms of environmental justice, and how this plays out across communities right here in the United States and in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is already such a great conversation and dialogue. I feel honored to be on a panel with each and every one of you. For me, I want to take you back to 2005 in Monroe, Louisiana, my hometown, where all I remembered was the smell of the bayou, family barbecues, and soccer. I remember the tranquility that I felt, and that was until Hurricane Katrina hit the shore of Louisiana. And every inequity and stressor was exacerbated and shown to the entire world. People did not realize that Louisiana and New Orleans, there was huge poverty. People just know Louisiana from Mardi Gras. And so we have to acknowledge the fact that this was not something new. This has been around. This was also the moment I was introduced to climate migration. People fleeing their homes, proper evacuation routes not being in place. When we talk about the poverty levels just within New Orleans proper, 70% of the population doesn't own a car. And so how were they supposed to get out? We didn't have the evacuation routes weren't in place, but it was also the fact that we didn't have backup transportation for majority of the population who does not own a vehicle. Climate change is the threat that we all know about. We're constantly learning more about it each day because it's consistently escalating. We are hearing more and more about unsurvivable storm surges. So it's not just 40% of the world's population who lives within 100 kilometers off a coast who are going to be affected. It's each and every one of us. It's not just those environmental and economical impacts, but it's the migration, the health, the sociocultural, the racial, the housing, the food insecurity. When we talk about these stressors and inequities, then it's talking about going back and looking in your history books. Oh, well, maybe they weren't actually in there because we don't actually acknowledge all of our history within America. So it's looking it up. What is redlining and how has redlining continued to affect Americans here right now? These are the same areas where you are seeing high polluted areas, where you're seeing landfills, where you're seeing inequitable budgets to schools. So climate migration is not something that we can ignore. This is something that is going on here in your very own backyard. This is a global human issue. It transcends politics. We have got to address this on multiple levels. We have to make sure that we're having the conversation at the family dinner table, on family Zoom, happy hour, in the classroom. We all have to work together holistically, and we have different expertise, we have different perspectives, but that's what makes the world go round. And the last thing I would say is that we have got to bring together the immigration and refugee organizations and the environmental organizations. This is not a siloed issue. This is an issue that has to be worked on together.
That's so well said, and I love that you said that, given that you've also worked at HIAS, which is a refugee resettlement agency, which is great, because I do want to, I find, of course, the same challenge, right? I come from the refugee protection world, and I don't come, I mean, I'm not a climate scientist like you are, Jasmine, and I don't come from an environmental background, but of course I've spent the great, the last 6-7 years becoming educated about environmental policy. It seems like there is such a disconnect, even in immigration in this country, in understanding that we have established, for lack of a better term, to keep this very conversational for everybody, lanes, right? Immigration is a catch-all phrase. But let's not forget that the rhetoric is that immigration is everybody that comes to your border who's illegal. That's the rhetoric. And I see you nodding, Erica, because I know you know this well. And yet the truth is we have established laws, norms, practices, programs for asylum seekers. We have an established refugee resettlement program. We have pathways for even people who, as both Alma and Erica have spoken to, people who come here for a multitude of reasons, climate being amongst that. And we have an emerging situation in which people need to understand that no one is going to come across a border and articulate that they left on the basis of climate change, unless of course it's a disaster, maybe, and disaster displacement is something quite different to what we've been talking about here, right? Which is climate is this exacerbating force, right? There are all these sort of like social disruptions and economic disruptions, political disruptions. So what I see happening is we have these established lanes, as I said, and then at the same time, we have a conversation that doesn't understand really what this looks like. So with that sort of landscape, how do we speak about this to the public? How do we, how do we engage our elected officials to understand that global policy needs to be encompassing of these realities? I'll let anybody start wherever they wish.
I can jump in. This is such an important conversation because unfortunately, even within the immigration context, when we talk about immigration reform or the immigrant rights movement, right? It's, I mean, you name it. Even us, right? We focus so much on, I think, the symptoms or what we see right now, right? There's millions of people who are undocumented. There's thousands of people who are in detention centers or who are, crossing the border, either seeking asylum or just crossing, right? And we want to fix a lot of it, but we hardly ever have a conversation on what's causing people to move. And, for me, and I get a little personal here on even my own story, I want to have these conversations because, as someone who came from Mexico in the 90s when NAFTA happened, and we had in the town where my mother grew up and her mother and some of my ancestors, it was a really small town in Mexico that people, I still remember going as a child, people were living out of the river and the crops, and the river was so important to them. And after happened, there's an American company that moves into town, literally right by this really small town, and starts dumping all of their stuff in the river, right? They're just dumping and dumping into the river. And next thing you know, the town has 2 families left in there, right? And everybody else gets where they're at. We're here, right? We had to find a place. And my family tried, going to the city, and that's where I was born. And unfortunately, because we were poor, we ended up moving into the United States. Now, why do I share this? Because to me, even within my own story and the stories of our clients at Raices, I see that there is a reason of people moving. And what I remind the public and people as I talk to them about this issue is, just think of yourself. If you were a person, or if you are a person who's poor, who's working class, perhaps, who is a person of color, a minority, right? Someone who's in this country, it's poor, and you have to move. What are usually the reasons, right? The reasons are economic, because you need to find a way to give your family a better life economically. Maybe because you were displaced because of something that happened in your city, as Jasmine was talking about. It might have been, other reasons, but hardly do you have somebody who is just willing to pick up all their belongings, gather all their kids, and make a really painful journey through the border and through other countries, perhaps, when you're coming from far away, just for fun. You don't just, or just because you want to go and I don't know, do what in another country. You do it out of necessity. And so let's have those conversations in the context of immigration, in the context of climate, in the context of the economy, and really figure out what is the root cause of all of this. If not, we're not going to solve this problem. We're just going to solve some of the symptoms.
Absolutely. Alma, would you agree with that? I mean, you're talking to to farmers and to a lot of people on at the border, and you've been doing this for a very long time. How do we engage the public, the politicians who don't quite understand that it's not going to be this neat package?
Well, I think it's very important to understand that these climate injustices and environmental disasters that are happening in Central America are also happening here in the United States. A few years ago, the University of Berkeley created a map of greenhouse emissions and pollution in the United States. And if you look at that map really correlates with the agricultural areas in the United States, like the California Central Valley, our little corner in Texas, in southern New Mexico. It's also a very highly polluted community, the Midwest. And we have to also understand that those type of agro industries, those type of models are really not only creating environmental disasters, but are also impacting the labor rights. They're based many times in exploitative work models, and they're causing many types of injustices in communities across the globe. So we have to be very mindful about the role of these global supply chains, the role of these agro industries, unregulated in many times agro industries, in really deteriorating our environment and deteriorating labor rights and the quality of life of communities across the globe. So we have to seek models and policies, actually, that really look at sustainability over the long term. So it's about reducing carbon emissions, but it's also about shifting the paradigm and really trying to look at the community level and figure out how some communities also have been working to rebuild their local ecosystems, their local food systems, and rebuilding their livelihoods in Central America, in the United States, in many parts of the world. And I think that conversation really has been in many ways invisible to some climate activists, immigrant rights organizations, and even global advocacy organizations, that there are efforts on the ground that have been successful, that have been building resiliency at the community level. And we need to look at those models, learn from the communities that are on the ground, that are restoring their wetlands, their ecosystems, their farming systems, and playing a key role in stabilizing local communities. At the same time, we also, as a community, we have to be really cognizant that migration is also a form of adaptation. And we have to create a regime that really guarantees the rights of people on the move. And it's not only about guaranteeing rights, about recognizing rights, it's also about understanding and benefiting from the contributions of these communities that are moving from the global south to the global north, who come with a series of knowledge, tools, and skills to restore ecosystems, to restore food systems, and to restore livelihoods. You know, we saw it here on the US-Mexico border when the pandemic hit. It was small-scale farmers, mainly immigrant farmers, that were producing food for local food consumption because due to the many border restrictions, many rural communities didn't have any food. And many of these communities were working, you know, in cotton fields or, you know, pecan fields and didn't have access to food. So it was the local small-scale farms that were able to respond immediately to the food crisis. And there's local small-scale models, you know, that are really setting an example on how to mitigate and address and prevent many climate challenges and disasters at the local level. So I think we need really strong rights-based frameworks and really strong partnerships between governments, advocacy organizations like our organizations, scientists, and communities, and particularly communities, so that we can use the knowledge or build a system that it's built upon the knowledge of and the needs of local communities.
Absolutely. I think that's a really great point, Adrian, that I'd like to ask you, coming up with the COP negotiations and everything leading up to it as well. You know, so many of the Central American migrants, really asylum seekers that we're seeing across the region are, you know, predominantly indigenous communities, and you know, there's been very little development. There's been very little data research over time to even know how many indigenous communities, you know, reside in the dry corridor. This is my understanding from human rights actors who do work in that region. There's also a historical legacy here of everything Alma said about extractive industries and, you know, gang violence that has shifted now to sort of maybe directly or indirectly supporting some of the extractive industries and such, that is sort of changing the biodiversity in the dry corridor. There are issues of land rights, you know, which again also feed into migration, forced migration, when people don't have adequate land for adaptation, right? When climate hits and there's crop failures, you have livelihood loss. Well, we're talking about incredibly poor people who don't have access to land that's actually being taken away from them. We're talking about indigenous people who have been marginalized, of a historical legacy of even oppression and even massacres. And we have yet indigenous communities that don't have enough of a voice and seat at the table. We've got the COP26 negotiations coming up. What can we do? What are the mechanisms in place, and are they strong enough to have these exact points, these voices represented?
So I think one of the things that we have to always keep very clear in our mind is that there's like a double oppression. There's racism and injustice within our countries in Central America towards those communities, and that's a big issue. But there's also that international system that doesn't really care about loss and damage and climate impacts and everything that we're seeing, that it just goes beyond what adaptation can do in a country. And we did already have vulnerable contexts within our Central American countries and in many other regions where climate impacts are taking place. But climate change is something that is imposed. It's something that is not natural, is made by persons, it's made by some countries than others, and we can ask for justice and we can ask for responsibility. And just to sort of like dimension the scale of loss and damage in the world, like there's estimates that it costs around 100 to 200 billion per year until 2030 on loss and damage. So the things that move people to cross borders to secure their life, it's in the scale, it's a great scale. And right now we're not even in 1.5 degrees, and we might get to 2 degrees. So we're in the prologue of climate impacts and what this drive people to secure the human dignity. So we're not even there in the discussion of where the Paris Agreement and the climate policy will take it. So for COP26, what we have to ask is for it's very mind-blowing as a Central American. It is very sometimes discouraging, is to make first our own governments in our vulnerable countries to ask for their rights, to ask for justice, and then get the other countries to actually care for the system to actually respond and address, for example, Article 8 in the Paris Agreement about loss and damage, that then in turn addresses migration and addresses vulnerable communities and addresses the systemic injustice that we're seeing that ties to other economic and political situations that we already have, but that is reflected in how climate change is governed. So for us, just having an issue called loss and damage, and then talk also about migration within COP26, it's a win, because it's not something that is usually in the agenda. It is not something that is funded. It's something that usually it's only respond with spaces about knowledge exchange. And while knowledge exchange between vulnerable organizations that are responding to climate change is useful, what people need is a way to secure their lives and resources to do that, not only just spaces to talk. And that's where we at in the UNFCCC. And for COP26, then we need to materialize alternative funding for loss and damage to where climate change is impacting. And this significant change of addressing climate impacts based on responsibility and equity, which is in the Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. So we're talking already about international law, about existing obligations. It's sort of where we should move towards justice and responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jasmine, I feel like we've gotten so far in this conversation on climate change as a whole, because of movement building, because of youth leaders, really. And now we have an opportunity, it feels like, and maybe I'm too close to it to know if this is really accurate, but we now have an opportunity to really speak about the human impacts of climate change. There's been a lot of movement building to get politicians to recognize that there's a grave crisis. And now we can sort of parcel out, well, what does that look like in different places in the world? So, a lot of the things that we're talking about here, we're talking about environmental racism. What is the work that, so many of the climate leaders that you're working with, what can they do? How can we take that same movement building now and amplify all the work that, frontline actors like you all are speaking about can do to sort of address and help leaders understand what this looks like?
Yeah, that's a great question. At OC, our climate, we run a leadership development program for high school and college students. So really giving them that educational background of what climate change is, what's movement building, what's organizing, coalition building, climate policy. We get them in front of elected officials. So have been very effective on the state level, and we are now working on the federal level as well. Showing them and the world that some of the state level policy we have already passed, such as New York CLCPA, is now being introduced as national legislation here in the United States. One thing that our kids like to say, I call them the kids, they want people to know that activism looks a variety of ways. I think when many of us on this panel were growing up, it looked as you were in the streets with a poster. And the kids these days, they're extremely creative. They're some of the most knowledgeable individuals out there across a wide variety of issues, and know that it is so intersectional. So at Our Climate, we like to do social media campaigns. If you're not a extroverted person and want to talk a lot, you can be very informational or informative and get on your social media. A bunch of our kids have started to do TikTok videos. I have not veered in that direction. My assistant wants me to, but the kids love it. And then it's about being able to sit down, have conversations with your family. I talked about that earlier. Only 40% of Americans are actually having the conversation about climate change, even though more than half of Americans know that it's going to impact them. We have to change the dialogue. We have to make it a human issue to people who don't want to say the words climate change or deny that it's actually going on, because you can't deny someone's personal story. That's their story. And then it's being able to get the information across in a variety of ways. We all learn and receive information different ways. So sometimes for elected officials, or if it's a listening session with the community, it's being able to have that PowerPoint slideshow, but then it's also making sure there's an interactive Q&A for people. I like to say OC is the catalyst for young people becoming visionaries, activists, and leaders in their own communities. Every social justice movement, great one, has started on the community level. And this cohort of individuals, Gen Z and millennials, are extremely reflective of the individuals who were growing up in the 60s and fighting for the civil rights movement. They want to sit down, they want to listen, they want to share. They want to acknowledge what's been done and the inequities and stressors that exist, but they want to get to the solutions. So not afraid to actually have those taboo conversations. And I think this is really why we are starting to see movement. This is why you are starting to hear directly from administrative officials such as EPA Administrator Reagan, I want to make sure that we are engaged with the youth. This is not just having a youth advisory council, but this is also making sure that we are having listening sessions across the United States. We are making sure that they are part of forming policy. You're part of the drafting stages of policy. And that's really what our climate does, and very much excited for what's to come because of the movement we are starting to see. We have a long ways to go, but this past few months with the Biden administration has put hope for a lot, for a lot of us, I'll say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the central messages too that we might all want to work on. Once we do sort of reach a larger group, a larger population that understands that climate change is forcing people to move across borders, then some of the discourse comes in, which is that most people will be displaced internally. And while that's true, I think it's incredibly important to keep in mind that that does not minimize their need for protection. That does not mean, that we have any less of an obligation as a global community. Very much to all the points that, Adrienne was making about the fact that, there's a differentiated responsibility here. And that's actually a principle of international law here. That's enshrined in the UNFCCC, in the convention. So, I think these are also very important points that we need to raise, that just crossing an international border and having someone that might be outside international laws that protect them isn't the only challenge that we might face, in terms of like the migration field. Protection has a much broader concept. And I think, when we're dealing with globally a securitized and a very, border and militarized response, the general public might tend to see this as, well, this isn't my responsibility, or this isn't my problem. We have problems at home as well, because as you've mentioned, Jasmine, I mean, it's obviously impacting all of our communities at home as well. And we all know that those communities are already the marginalized, the minority, the Black and people of color and immigrant communities. So there's just so much intersectional work and dialogue that needs to take place, and it's really fabulous to have the intersection of all these of all of you here. I want to take a little break from some of our conversation and head to some of the questions, because there are so many that have come in. And so maybe we'll go a little bit off our plan, and I'll ask some of these questions. Here's one question from Idalia and Maya. Can we discuss the role local government and local level advocacy to support state and federal government policies on climate migration? So the role of local government and local advocacy to support state, federal government policies on climate migration. Maybe, well, I mean, I'll let anyone start.
I think local governments have a key role to play in addressing climate change and climate challenges at the local level. I think there's many issues that are local in nature, in terms of soil compactation, in terms of water accessibility, the depletion of water supplies at the local levels, and implementing strategies at the local level that can increase resiliency. I've seen some efforts in New Mexico, for instance, in which local governments provide supports to farmers who farm at a small scale, who are doing, water harvesting, who are doing, more sustainable and diversified ways of really farming at the local level. So there's a lot of incentives that local governments can do, like at the local level, to kind of reduce our local footprint. At the same time, local governments can be champions at the same time, like at the state and federal levels, to pass policies that can help us address the different impacts of climate change. As someone that lives and works on the border, also, I think local governments have a tremendous role to play in terms of passing immigrant rights and protection agendas, that can, create firewalls to protect migrant communities' rights and access to basic social services, since the federal government, particularly the federal government from the previous administration, was such a tragedy for many migrant communities and for border communities, that local governments really can set an example about what is the future that we want to pursue as a community, and what is the future that we want to see in terms of not only addressing climate change, but really creating a culture that is built upon human rights and respect and dignity for each and everyone that is part of the community, regardless of where we come from. And so I really hope that we develop an agenda and that we work at the local levels to kind of build our way up, to the national levels.
Thank you, Alma. If I may, I might move on to another question unless someone else has something. Yeah. Okay. Richard Kalu has a question, and I know he's a researcher. Any ideas on public awareness and participation in general, he's asking. I feel any legislation reform would require adequate empirical data surrounding public willingness to accommodate and overall awareness of the issues. Before I open that up, I will say, if anyone hasn't seen it, the recent study that came out of Duke University, it was two researchers, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the other university involved, that had empirical data that showed a correlation between climate changes, rainfall variability, and violence, or rather, rainfall variability, increased migration to the U.S. borders, which also then led to increased violence. And this was in Honduras. This just came out on April 1st, maybe just at the beginning of the month. So to Richard's point, that's something that we might want to look at. I feel it's incredibly helpful to have that kind of empirical data, which of course is supporting some of the qualitative things that we've all been talking about, that Erica, you mentioned, that I certainly hear from the migrants and asylum seekers that we've been speaking to at the border. So I'll repeat the question. Any ideas on public awareness and participation and how you sort of generate that? And legislation reform would require adequate empirical data surrounding public willingness to accommodate overall awareness of the issues. So how do we exactly, get that empirical data, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah. I would just say, I mean, I don't necessarily have an answer, just like in general, how do we get more data? What we're trying to do with Raíces, and we're still in the process of, just looking at our own data and our own clients. And again, as I would mention at the very beginning, it's easy for us to say, this many people left because of violence, because that is one of the, if somebody is seeking asylum in the United States right now, they have, the ability to ask for asylum if they are leaving because of violence, let's say, right? And if there is a really strong, if they have a strong case, then they might be able to fight their case in front of a judge and be able to stay here with asylum. So we're able to see, perhaps easier, like how many people left because of that, or other reasons. But we're right now in the process of figuring out how we can also ask some of those questions to kind of assess, like, and keep track of how many people we're actually seeing who have a very, very specific that the reason they left is very likely because of climate change. And again, it's a little bit harder because people won't tell us that, right? Like somebody, a lot of our kids right now who we're seeing in the influx facilities, you'll probably have seen the news. There's a lot of children who are migrating on their own right now, and we represent a lot of them. Right now we have, I think, done intakes with more than 1,000 kids in the past few months, and majority of them are indigenous. I wouldn't say majority, I'm sorry, I don't want to speak out of line. I think out of our experience, many of them are indigenous because we don't have a number, and many of them have these stories. But again, the kids are not necessarily telling us, well, I left because this is, because of climate migration. So we're hoping that we can get a lot more of that data. I would say though that the stories are also very important, and that's the other part that we're trying to do, right? That the data is super important for people to know and see the numbers and have a bigger picture. But I think in the organization, what we're also trying to do is work a lot more with our clients for them to be able to share their stories, and for people to just really connect to the why, right? Why they're leaving, and I think somebody else in the panel has said it before, that just being able to hear those stories is so impactful, and it can really make a change in the narrative. So that's what we're trying to do in Raíces.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. No, I think that's absolutely true, and it's frustrating that the stories aren't necessarily enough, because I mean, in the refugee context, people don't necessarily articulate their testimonies in exactly the way, the 1951 convention needs them to. The whole reason I ended up founding this organization is because I heard people speaking about climate and environmental concerns and livelihood loss over and over and over again for so many years, far more than they were even the conflicts at home, because the conflicts had become so entrenched and so a part of like everyday life. And yes, it was the primary reason why people fled, but it didn't change the fact that the conflict was of course a social disruptor, just as climate change was at the same time. And we have those same exact dynamics at place in place today, both in conflict zones and non-conflict zones. And we have to remember too that conflict zones aren't necessarily, understood, aren't necessarily like defined even as a conflict. I mean, Central America, there are certainly situations where people are fleeing violence, but one wouldn't necessarily classify it as a conflict zone, right? So these are extremely complicated and not so easily defined terms. And when it comes to this issue of climate change, we expect everything to fit into these very neat little boxes, so that presents extra challenges as well. Alma, yes.
Yes, no, I just wanted to say that we need really to build a rights and resilience framework and agenda at the various levels, at the local, at the national, and at the global levels. And that agenda really needs to include robust consultations with directly impacted communities, with the scientists, with policymakers, with the community organizations, to try to figure out, perhaps even develop like a set of indicators, that allows to measure, how is our community handling the different environmental and political, challenges that we're confronting at the local level, and how we can figure out an agenda that really a rights-based agenda, that really protects and really help us articulate or envision, migration governance, for those that are escaping or fleeing because of climate change and climate disasters. And there's examples of communities who have been doing amazing work in Alaska, for instance, and in certain parts of Africa. There's been discussions at the community level in which communities get to define like some set of social ecological indicators that related to access to water, access to land, access to health, conditions of the soil, et cetera, that can allow them to plan for mitigation strategies, but also adaptation and resettlement strategies. But these strategies and these agendas need to include the communities. Communities cannot be at the receiving end of these, advocacy strategies or that are not worked and developed in consultation with the communities. Communities in the end have the knowledge of what they need and have the knowledge many times on what are the solutions, that are needed to address these very pressing issues of climate change. And so I think as the National Network, we're trying as much as possible with our small capacity to kind of map the community organizations that are doing amazing work on the ground on the US-Mexico border, to try to understand what are some of the pressures. We're calling it the human rights pressures that are not necessarily limited to pressures or human rights concerns within the immigration system. We're also trying to understand what is happening in terms of food accessibility, water accessibility, like at the local level along the border, and try to figure out what is the work and who are the leaders that are addressing these multiple issues, so that we look at border governance and migration governance, not only on a limited scale, like your rights while in the system of detention, but we look at a very comprehensive level and robust and holistic understanding of what human rights for migrants means, and particularly for those that are not protected under the international refugee agreements or regime.
Ali, I wanted to add a little bit on that. I think there's two things that I want to mention. First, that there is a complete disorder from the UN on the multiple different definitions of what is going on, because all the UN agencies know that there is something going on between people, moving, and climate change, but they just define it differently. So if you define something different, you're not tackling it. You cannot generate data. You cannot generate a response that fits human rights. So that's one thing. And I'm sorry, but I don't find that that is just an accident. It is a product of the governance of climate change, of the governance of an issue that affects the most vulnerable, that is not top in the agenda. And then the other issue that unfortunately many slow onset events are very hard to understand for people on the ground, and some extreme weather events such as hurricanes, it's very hard to differentiate something that is supposed to be natural between something that is induced by human action. And that is sort of where climate change and helping communities sort of understand that, and then leaving them not as victims, but as right holders to be able to claim, to call for justice, because that's an unjust situation that they're being put on, is very important. So working with people also to understand and to see how the impacts or the issues that they're dealing with are connected with climate change is one of those things that you have to do for them to become aware, and then for them to be able to claim their rights.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree with that. And there are a number of questions here about, so what should we do? I mean, should we have a wider definition of the 1951 Refugee Convention? Should there be a separate sort of convention regime, that protects this sort of category of people? So I'll say that generally, but I'd also like us to think about, what are you hearing from the communities themselves? What is it that they want? I mean, I'm sure that in my experience, nobody wants to be forced to leave their homes, but what people do want is protection when they are forced to leave. And as Adrian was just saying, you know, people are forced to leave because of inaction, right? Because of this, because of the injustice of situations that have been forced upon certain communities disproportionately. So how exactly do we address that when we have a lack of political will to even name it? Anyone? And even at the local level, you know, Jasmine, I mean, we see this happen internally right here in the United States, you know, with internal communities, and you see it happen all around the world as well. So it's not a problem just across borders either. The injustice is inherent and it runs across.
Yeah, I'll actually speak both from the local and the international level. You know, in general, people want protections. Whenever you are fleeing from your home for whatever it may be, mentally, you are going through something. You've lost your home, you've lost your job, you're taking care of your family, you're trying to figure out where are you going to go? Are you going to have a support system there? What school are your kids going to go to? Is there a school available for them to get into? So all of these things are playing in your head. On the international level, there's got to be a change because, and it has to come from the top because it has to trickle down, and it's going to look different in different contexts. But we have got to have, you know, a global policy and where there are mandated protections in place for persons who are migrating due to climate change. We have got to make sure on a country level, what are those protections? How are we implementing those? The world is not really a welcoming place in regards to putting together policies and protections for the most vulnerable. That's not something the world is actually great at right now. And so, you know, I even saw in Indonesia where I was doing my research and working with the Bajo people. You're talking about people who lived on their boats for decades and then they were ostracized and having to live on land, but not given the same rights as other Indonesians. And so now you're having these islands that are disappearing due to sea level rise. So they're already dealing with these inequities and these stressors. People want to know that they can go somewhere safe, that there's going to be a pathway to citizenship for them, that there's a pathway for them to be part of the community. And so it's very important that we make some changes on the global level and have those clear implementation pathways for them all the way down to the local level.
Yeah, anyone else want to comment on the convention, on the Global Compact for Migration, or any other creative pathways forward here?
I do. I find very ironic, like from the legal scholar side on the definition, because the definition is just a political sort of historical conception of why should you provide protection. It was built for Europe after World War II. It has evolved. It evolved in how the African Union understands it. It has evolved how the Latin American organization understand it through the Declaration of Cartagena. It fits the necessity of people. It fits the idea of protecting human rights. It does not fit the need to understand the percentage of the decision of a person to cross a border and find safety. You don't need that. You just need to know, and as we do know, that there is a threat to them and that there is a connection to climate change and that they require help and that they are requiring help by the great numbers, and they will continue to do so because we do not address correctly the impacts of climate change. So I think regarding with the definition, even if you don't do it, if you don't adjust that conception of what is a refugee, you do have to create one that is legally binding, that provides international protection. And everything we have from ACNUR to all the different agencies from the UN are non-binding, do not provide international protection. So don't call them refugees, call them what you want, but provide international protection for their human rights. And that is something that politically has been done before. It's something that countries across regions understand they should do and have done it before. And it's something that should be done in the context of climate change.
100%. I'm sure you're all seeing how much this question is just popping up over and over and over again, and how many times I also am asked this question on every panel I sit on, especially since my organization is, named Climate Refugees, which is rather offensive to quite a few people. I will say that to add to what Adrian just said, we have no legal definition for the term migrant either, and it's interesting to me how much the international community wants to use the term climate migrant in a situation of forced movement. It's quite a challenge, isn't it? Because how we're talking about people who are being forced to move, where there's a compounding crises, and yet we want to talk about terminology and the lack of sort of frameworks and conventions, which are all of which are true. But when we use terms that have no legal basis whatsoever, that's also just as problematic as using a term like refugee, which doesn't fit the exact definition, but certainly has a connotation of fitting what people are actually experiencing. And we have the regional agreements, and you have free movement protocols right now within the African continent, representative of understanding exactly what climate change is doing. So just to echo what Adrian said, and sort of to help answer the multitude of these questions. I'm going to ask one more question here from Steve Vigil, who has an enormous amount of experience in Central America and in peacekeeping, also with the UN, a lot of great community work he's done. So it's a good question. When we speak of advocacy and movement building relating to climate change and migration, it tends to be amongst the youth in the US and other Western nations. Are there connections between advocacy and movement building in Central America on these issues or elsewhere? And what is going on in the US? Anyone know things that we can build on?
I could answer, but I don't want to take too much space.
Absolutely, that's fine.
As a Central American NGO, we are part of different networks, and we are trying to sort of connect what our advocacy efforts to what is being done in other countries, including the US. And I mean, there is a big challenge, especially because most Latin American NGOs do not address climate impacts. It's mainly because there's no funding. It's very hard to do so without funding, and also because there's a lack of capacity building on that issue. Unfortunately, most of the cooperation agencies are focused on mitigation. Even in countries such as mine, with 0.1% of global emissions, carbon neutrality is the thing they're funding instead of climate impacts. So when you're faced that to sort of connect our priorities and urgencies on the ground to what is feasible and the capacities that our community leaders need to have to understand politically, have a political stance on issues such as this ones, is very hard. And sometimes Europeans or US climate advocates, if youth or not, have probably more developed positions on them than the actual people that are feeling the impacts on the global south. And is this sort of disparity between advocacy skills and knowledge of the governance process and availability of fundings to sort of fit the purpose of the priorities that communities could have. It's something that is very, it's sort of why there's a sort of not matching.
I just wanted to say that there is incredible work happening at the local level in rural communities in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Central America, different countries in Central America, There's a strong agroecologist movement. There's the Society of Latin American Agroecologists, SOCLA, that's doing amazing work in terms of diversifying farming ecosystems and have been actually measuring the adaptation and resilience of rural livelihoods. And they measure it precisely during Hurricane Mitch, how communities that use diversified farming strategies were more resilient to the effects of that hurricane than the communities that were using just conventional agriculture or places where were really impacted by big agriculture in the community. So there are very important efforts at the community level. Like Adrienne just mentioned, a lot of those efforts are also very localized. They're not necessarily funded and they're not visible in many of the policy and advocacy spaces that are happening, at the regional and at the global level. So we need to figure out how we can invest in the participation of local communities in this type of discussions. So perhaps they're not participating, but that does not mean that they're not already creating models and responses that are effective. The other thing is that we, the National Network, work with the Latin American Bloc on Migration, which is a network of about 80 organizations that are working with migrants. And we see how climate change is such a constant part of the reasons why people are moving north. But these organizations are also very depleted, trying to address the militarization and securitization crises that are happening not only at borders, but are happening also like along the migratory corridors. For instance, in these latest exodus or so-called caravans, many of these community organizations didn't even have access to those corridors, to the roads where these caravans or exodus, were migrating, because they were increasingly militarized. And these militarized and deterrence approaches are really, just resulting in grave human rights violations. Often policing and security forces are joining efforts to really try to stop these exodus in a very violent way. Are helping in the deportation of large deportations of these communities in mobility without any type of due processes. And we know that those are not necessarily sustainable. They're not effective, first of all, and they're not sustainable. And they're also, setting precedent for allowing, governments to violate human rights, the human rights of people in mobility, in a systematic basis. And many times, some of these militarization strategies or militarized strategies are being used, like in the name precisely of the Global Compact on Migration. So we, as a community level, really need to come together and really need to occupy the spaces and advocate, for right-centered frameworks, and not allow, the migration and the refugee conversations to escape from the domain of human rights, which are increasingly being securitized and in the domain of even private security corporations. So we need to advocate and we need to occupy those spaces.
Absolutely. Alma, where I 100% agree with all that. And we're going to be launching a campaign very soon. And I would love to incorporate all of your suggestions, all the work that you're doing into that. And I want to just throw it to Jasmine for a few seconds and ask you, Jasmine, before you have to leave, one thing you can tell us maybe that we could do to support your work, and we'll let you go. And we'll close up here with Erica also with a few seconds. And I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. How can you support us? Volunteer with Our Climate. You can head to our page, volunteer with us, and get involved in one of our target state programs or with our national programming. There's nothing like working with young people. It gives you life. They have a huge amount of energy and want to affect change. So just head over to www.ourclimate.us. And thank you again for having me today.
Thank you, Jasmine. Erica, if you don't mind, I'll ask you for a few seconds of your time. Tell us how we can help Raíces.
Yeah, I mean, we have, volunteer opportunities, we have advocacy opportunities if you want to, help us really change the systems, but you also, if you want to volunteer to do a lot of the direct legal, well, not legal services, but the services that we do, that's also another opportunity that you might have. Always, visit also, we can share the website here and our social media platforms. We're always looking for people to join this fight and ensure that we are creating a welcoming border and that we are also starting the conversation on the root causes of migration. So yes, thank you so much for having this amazing panel and this conversation. It was so great.
It's been my absolute pleasure to have all of you here. Thank you for just having a conversation. I did not want to spend time on definitions and terms. I just wanted you to talk about your work and, because we can all look those up. I will say in closing that, as I mentioned, Climate Refugees will be launching in the next few months a campaign called Frontlines. And it is a public digital campaign on actions you can take to help the millions of people who are at risk of climate displacement. And it will amplify the work of Raíces, of the network that Alma was speaking about, and all the community work that she just mentioned, that she can amplify, and then we can help amplify. All the regional work that La Ruta del Clima and the climate policy work, and all the great community and BIPOC work and youth movement building work that Jasmine is doing. So we will stay tuned. We will be sharing all of that. And I just thank you to all of you. Thank you to the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. Thank you to Representative Joaquin Castro. And I will turn it over to Columbia University for any last comments. And thank you to all our participants for attending and our panelists.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank Climate Refugees again and all of our participants for joining us. And we'd encourage you to visit our website to learn more about our activities and initiatives. Thank you, everyone.